Today I'm joined by Jason Snyder. He is a self-described metamodern localist, and he is on the faculty of Appalachian State University. And why I wanted to talk to him is that he is one of the leading voices, the leading faces of homesteading, of localism, and he has a lot of interesting things to say about that. So welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Alex. Great to be here.
Very happy to have you here. I'm curious, how does one get into this? How did what was your path? What was your path to this point? Because I
Yeah,
would say I'm trending that way as well. I'm probably a
yeah.
few years behind you, but I'm curious, kind of what was your path to this point?
It was long and tortured. I'll say that. My parents were hippies. They met on a commune. I grew up kind of, pretty left on the progressive side. Kind of became, through my graduate school, PhD, I was kind of on track to be a technocrat, kind of a, you could say a progressive technocrat, applied economics. And then in the last couple of years, I've just kind of something switched in my mind, and I've just started noticing the fragility of what we call like globalism or global capitalism, and the need to become more resilient as individuals, as communities. And part of what got me leading, led me down that path was from the environmental ecological side. Um, a lot of indicators show that we're in the midst of collapse, ecological collapse, as well as climate chaos. And thinking about it from a technocratic lens, I just saw that lens as pretty futile. And I started learning about things like bioregionalism, the regeneration scene. That also led into localism. And to me, localism, is all about reviving, regenerating both our ecologies, but also our culture and our community. And so, parallel with all that, I saw that, what we've seen with globalization is just the hollowing out of culture and communities and traditions. And so both of those things kind of converged, and here I am now. I wouldn't, I don't know if I describe myself as a trad, but I definitely resonate a lot with kind of, cottagecore, that kind of trad. But I also still have a foot in kind of you could say the left, but I just think that a lot of what we, see as the left now, especially this kind of merging of, corporate and state power, I just see it's the wrong way to go, and it's not going to end well.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, like all these definitions, right,
Mhm.
left, trad, I don't know, not non-trad,
Yeah,
neoliberal, modernist.
right.
They're starting to, lose their meaning day by day. I mean, I don't even know if they had like some coherent meaning. Everyone sees something else in them, but I do see a lot of people, showing an interest in scaling back and like in
Mhm.
degrowth and
Yeah.
in a critique, a considered, and by considered I mean not just rationalist critique
Mhm.
of what's going on, because like you said, collapse has been on my mind and on the mind of
Mhm.
a lot of people who are kind of in these spaces. And what I really enjoy about kind of the of about Twitter, essentially, because that's kind of the
Mhm.
space where where I found your stuff and where I get to interact with a lot of people, is that I see everyone kind of converging onto this field, but they're
Mhm.
coming from such different places, where I think that that's a really big asset. Because
Yeah.
I know kind of where I've come. I'm kind of like I'm pretty much a right winger, and
Mhm.
I come to this space and then you interact with all these like post left people who are like completely hyper Marxists, and in a way, if you boil down to the argument, we kind of all agree, this
Right.
what can't go on won't go on. And I think the
Mhm.
question is just what's next. So I'm curious what your vibe is with this whole movement and degrowth. And
Mhm.
is there kind of, is there something you're thinking about? Is that something you're thinking about in terms of, if, I guess you're a practical man, is there any practical approach to it that people might be able to take?
Yeah, well, so degrowth is kind of an academic concept, right? And it mainly comes from the left, the kind of the eco left. They're basically saying that, look, the level of material and energy throughput in our economy is incredibly wasteful, and we can actually the hypothesis is that we can achieve a better quality of life just with less waste, less material throughput. Um, and but I see that the people who are actually living degrowth in their lives or attempting to are often people who would describe as localists, right? And it's interesting because localists, I was just tweeting about this a few minutes ago, but localists don't tend to, you know, think of their project in terms of degrowth, but I see it as like the embodiment of degrowth, right? Of creating or relocalizing economies, making it more self-sufficient. It's not going to be totally self-sufficient. My neighbor's not going to make my computer for me, right? So there still needs to be scale for some things, but um, I think especially in terms of like thinking about traditional crafts, traditional agriculture, things like that. Like that, it was just much more in line with kind of meaningful livelihoods, I would say. Um, multi-generational livelihoods where there's tradition that develops, and it develops around all aspects of culture, from food, from recipes that your grandma had, and all of this great stuff. But it was also, I would say, more ecologically aware, um, even if it's not always so explicit. If you're localizing your livelihood a little bit, you're more in touch with kind of ecological limits. And if you destroy your topsoil, for example, eventually you're not going to be able to grow food, and you can't just import it from elsewhere. Go to a big chain grocery store and get it. And so it does kind of inherently put you in touch with kind of ecological living as well, or rewilding ourselves. There's so many different terms that can be used for these things depending on what kind of sociological movement you're a part of. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that makes a lot of sense, and there are definitely a lot of terms floating around
Yeah.
for everything. So
Mhm.
it seems to me like localism in a way is almost indistinguishable from resetting limits. So from the reintroduction of these
Mhm.
limits, because essentially being local is already a limit. It's a
Mhm.
space limit that you're imposing on yourself,
Yeah.
and I feel like that this extends into so many other things, because in a way, this runaway neoliberalism, what it has done is it's extremely good at reducing friction. It
Mhm.
reduces the touch points that you have with your
Yeah.
environment, reduces the touch points you have with the people around you. You're independent. It's a
Mhm.
catalyst for total independence, and essentially that's kind of why I what attracts me to things like localism, things like I live in a multi-generational home right now. This is
Yeah.
to say I live in a duplex with my mom, which is a good thing
Nice.
now because I'm gonna have a baby soon. So
Yeah.
this is a primo real estate that I'm inhabiting now.
Right.
So it's just kind of descaling, because I used to be very much one of these technocrats. I used to work in
Mhm.
tech. I guess I kind of
Mhm.
still work in a tech adjacent space,
Mhm.
and this is the kind of the reintroduction, the considered reintroduction of friction into my life,
Right.
was the kind of the step for me. I'm curious, what's do you think does that make sense? That's kind of my question.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. So I mean, localism, it's not so much, to me, it's not so much about left and right, but it's about scale, right? And you can have a localized commune that's super left, and you can have a community like the Amish, which arguably is more traditional, or I don't know if you'd say right necessarily. And so it's really it's the idea that, well, many different kinds of lifestyles perhaps can work. We've seen in the 70s a lot of the communes and stuff didn't really work out in the United States, but perhaps some of them can work. But it's really about it is about bringing in friction, because it's about internalizing your costs, right? In economics, you have this term of like externalities, right? Like environmental externalities, or the externalities if you outsource jobs, that has on those communities, things like that. And it's really about fully accounting for the costs in your life. So it's definitely not frictionless, right? Yeah, I mean, I actually I listened to one of your recent podcasts with the guy from I forget, but yeah, when he was talking, when you guys were talking about the frictionless society and how, like, in neoliberalism, it's kind of this attempt to create this kind of perfectly atomized society where people don't really have to interact with each other. There's no real culture, and yeah, I mean, that just seems like a dystopia. But if you want to have meaning in your life, there's going to be friction. I just think those two have to go hand in hand, right? Like, there has to be some struggle. Like, you might not get along with all of your family members or all of your neighbors, and there's going to be struggle, and you have to work things out. But that's part of having a meaningful life.
Yeah.
There's this concept called the hormetic zone, where stressors in your environment can make you more resilient, stronger up to a certain level. Beyond that, it traumatizes you, makes you weaker. But we do need stressors in our life, and if those stressors are well designed. By design, I don't necessarily mean I don't mean top down, but evolved. They make sense, right? Like, for example, you're a teenager and you're going through a rite of passage ceremony or something, right? Like, you're experiencing a lot of stressors, but it's making you, for a boy, it's making you into a man, right? Or and you have something analogous for women. Um, so it's not just, so it's about, we do need stressors, but also the right kind of stressors. And I think something like neoliberalism, it attempts to make things frictionless. It atomizes us, but it also brings in a whole bunch of new stressors through the back door. Psychological distress that is much more abstract and hard to pin down and kind of placeless. Like, it doesn't really exist anywhere, but people don't I think many people in today's world or in modernity just feel like there's something missing in their life. There's something lacking. And I definitely felt that. Like, I had this kind of, low key depression for a long time that I couldn't really pin down, living in a suburb and things like that. And, now getting started with the homesteading and things like that, like, it's very stark to me, that what I was missing, because I don't have that same existential angst anymore in the same way.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely resonates with me a lot. I was reading something recently about how people are, when they try to relax, they essentially engage in the same type of activities that cause their burnout or cause their them kind of to overheat in the first place. And that there are not many opportunities for people to relax
Mm,
in modern culture,
right.
because you would have to be engaging with other parts of your brain to kind of give these parts, the screen,
Mm,
hyper input parts of your brain a relaxation. But if you think about how people relax nowadays, they play a video game, which is, hyper input, or they watch a movie, or they watch a different, read a book or something. It's still kind of, you're still in the
mm,
stream of hyper input. And it's not surprising that. And just sitting there, if you're good at meditation, you can do that. But most people,
mm,
idea of meditation, sitting for 10 minutes on a pillow a day,
yeah.
it takes a while for you to get there. And I realized, just doing stuff myself, um, manual labor, just
Yeah.
doing things, is a type of brain activity that is not, just being hooked up to the main line of information and just receiving.
Mm,
Is essentially, yeah, just completely doing something else, and it's the most relaxing thing you can do. Plus, you're
mm,
tired as hell afterwards, and then you
right.
can sleep okay, and don't have
Mm.
those stress dreams about tigers mauling you or whatever. I don't know what other people's have, but that's a recurring one for me. I don't know. It's is that a thing that you've seen, being more engaged in? And I guess there's a lot of manual labor on the homestead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned meditation, because I used to be kind of a meditation nut, and I still enjoy meditation, but I'm not nearly as hardcore. But one thing that meditation taught me was the importance of the body and locating emotions and thought streams, connecting, like, for example, kind of recursive thought streams that were producing some kind of suffering, connecting it to sensations in the body. And so then this led me into this whole kind of literature called, enactivism, or embodied cognition, of how much knowledge and information is actually kind of stored in the body. And the mind body connection is much more integrated than I think a lot of kind of rationalistic type of people really think. But there was a natural kind of connection with embodied cognition, kind of a sister concept is situated cognition, which is being kind of more embedded into your environment, and your environment kind of becomes like you co-evolve with your environment, and there arises a set of affordances, what are called affordances, where like the environment almost kind of becomes an extension of yourself, and also it modulates your behavior and your thinking, but you also modulate it as well, and there's this kind of like evolutionary dynamic, and I think that what you're saying about manual labor is spot on. I don't. I do think it's good, with modern technology that we have the opportunity to get rid of like the most brutal kinds of manual labor, like, that just, destroys people's bodies and, by the time they're 40 or something. But I do think that many of us need to get back to like using our body and our mind in conjunction with each other. And this, for me, like, so I just yesterday I bought a scythe, right? And I could buy a mower, and then I can mow my lawn and then I can go for a jog, or I could just get a scythe, you know, perform the same job and get my exercise at the same time. And this is just an example to me of like how ridiculous some elements of modernity are. Of like, everything is so compartmentalized, where like we have to go to the gym because our life, is no longer connected to our body, really. And
Yeah, yeah. Having a cleaner and going to the gym is quite an interesting
right.
thing.
Exactly. And I feel great. I mean, I try and get out every day for at least like 30 minutes to an hour to do like physical labor outside. Like there's just no better form of mental health cultivation than that to me.
Yeah, that's definitely it. I go for walks, which is not that great because we live in kind of like a small city, so it's still an urban
Mhm.
environment. We've got a garden and everything, but it's still kind of a central place. But I'd love to be able to just be a bit closer to nature. But that's in the future. That's the plan.
Mhm.
We're about
Nice.
2 years away from the homestead as well, but
Yeah.
we're still gearing up for it. I'm curious. There's a term you mentioned, doomer optimism. What is doomer
Mhm.
optimism? I'm curious about that.
Yeah. Well, so it's not a term that I coined, but I'm good friends with the person who I think coined it. So there's this whole kind of what are called doomers, or black, you've taken the black pill. And you can be a doomer for different reasons. You could be a doomer because you see that, the state is becoming oppressive for right, from the left or from the right. You could be a doomer because you see climate change is spinning out, can spin out of control, or ecological degradation can spin out of control. And so a doomer just generally means that you think that we're all in a lot of trouble, right? And society is going to collapse somehow
Yeah,
for
count me
for
in.
some, right? Exactly. Political decay, institutional decay, and for any reason. And the optimism part comes in where you kind of recognize that, okay, you've internalized that things, there is some kind of collapse or decay, but with that collapse or decay provides new opportunities for some kind of regeneration, whether it be culturally, ecologically, et cetera. And so it's kind of thinking, I used to be a member of what's called the Baha'i faith, and they have this concept of the crumbling of the old world order and the building of the new. And you shouldn't concern yourself so much with the crumbling of the old world order, but you should focus on creating the new institutions, the new ways of living that will arise in their place, kind of from the ashes. And even the crumbling order, can almost be thought of as kind of a kind of a compost. An example. This might not be a great example, but I think it may be gestures that we're getting at. So we have this kind of COVID pandemic thing, right? And it's a big shock to the system. I tend to think that much bigger shocks are coming, but it's a big shock. And it affects many of us, to a greater or lesser degree. But certain opportunities arise from this. One is we see this kind of remote work revolution thing, which I think a lot of people don't have that opportunity. But for the people who can work remotely, they have the opportunity to live wherever they want. So, for example, they can move out of a big city or a suburb and go start a homestead, right? And I'm not saying that that's like, that's enough to move towards localism itself, because localism would imply an investment in your local economy and actually getting more and more of your livelihood from the locality, or the region. But it's a step. It can be a step in the right direction for a lot of people. And so that's just, I don't know if that's a great example, but it's an example where some kind of shock to the system creates an opportunity to create an alternative, better system. At least at the seed stage, at a grassroots level. Um, so that's where the optimism comes in. Is like, okay, like, the current trajectory of society is not going in a good direction, but hey, like, you know let's let's not waste all of our energy fighting against a crumbling system. Let's spend our energy building up something better.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. Kind of like a having the phoenix mindset. Always
Yeah, yeah,
make the
exactly.
best out of these ashes.
Yeah.
um, um, you're obviously deeply involved in homesteading permaculture. You kind of have deep knowledge in the space. Is there a white pill you can share with people? Like what's the biggest white pill in this space? Like what's your reason for
Yeah.
hope?
Well, I'm still a I just I'm still a baby in the space. I've only been homesteading for about a year, and I'm still kind of a baby homesteader and a baby permaculturalist. I'd say the white pill is that, so tied with this notion of localism is there's this other notion of cosmopolitan localism. And the cosmopolitan part comes in, with, for example, what we're doing right now. We're talking with each other in other parts of the world. As Joe Norman put it, this isn't a local conversation, but it is small scale. It is decentralized, right? And those two concepts kind of go hand in hand. And so we do, for what I'm thinking of as like a 21st century new localism is that you have the kind of localization of production, uh, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on, I think some things are more amenable to that than others, and livelihoods, but you still have this kind of cosmopolitan element of like exchanging ideas and innovations across the space. And so, for example, in permaculture, I just see that there seems to be a lot of grassroots innovation. Just if you go on YouTube and type in permaculture, you'll find hundreds of videos of people like, trying things, maybe taking information from books, but then adapting it to their own circumstance. They develop new knowledge, new insight, which then they share. And so there seems to be kind of an opportunity to bootstrap, this kind of movement, because we have this kind of information flow, which we didn't have in the past. And so this is definitely a different kind of localism. And so I'd say the white pill is that I just think that the permaculture movement has really exploded, in the last decade, in the last couple of decades, and you're finding people from many different walks of life, from kind of more traditionally minded people, like local. I mean, permaculture really is just kind of traditional or indigenous agriculture, rebranded, right, and with new kind of people innovating in the space. And so I find that especially people who are interested in kind of like natural law, and these notions of um, of just being kind of tied to tradition and culture, they're really attracted to permaculture, for one set of reasons, and then people on the left who are worried about environmental issues are also really attracted to permaculture for another set of issues. So it seems to be kind of a unifying bridge where, not that these communities are going to like each other or necessarily want to live with each other, and that's fine, right? Localism allows for diversity of living arrangements and experiments in living, but there is this kind of like, to me, this kind of bootstrapping of, a lot of innovation, really quickly. And by innovation, I don't mean high tech. Most of it's pretty low tech, but it's really like clever. It's really ingenious stuff of just like, create your hoop house this way, and you get like, much better results. And that kind of information, if there's proof of concept, it can spread really quickly. And so that, I would say, that's, to me, is the biggest white pill. Is just kind of this decentralized, the decentralization movement in general, and what it enables in terms of, kind of, hundreds and thousands of experiments and living and sharing these learnings, in different contexts and adapting to different contexts.
Yeah, that
That would be
definitely
my big
makes
take.
sense, and it's I feel like it translates into, again, other areas as well, because like you said, that you might have kind of like a right wing permaculturalist next to left wing
Mhm.
permaculturalist, but I feel like
Yeah,
these two, even ideologically, they're starting to intertwine in ways I haven't really seen before, because
yeah,
on the right you see kind of the the Koch brothers libertarian consensus kind of crumbling at the moment, and there's
right.
also a movement of kind of conservative conservationists coming
Yeah,
up who are much more ecologically minded, who are much more open to argument. They're not just going to say, "Oh, it's all a conspiracy," and these
right,
hippies want to destroy the economy.
right.
But there's just quite a lot of open mindedness on both sides. So I think
Mhm.
that's really interesting, and it's heartening because I grew up in the mountains here in Romania, and I know a lot about nature. I was really kind of into foraging, and yeah,
Mhm.
I'm really I'm really concerned about these spaces, and
Mhm.
it's I'm happy that things are converging in a positive way. So do you think that there's I don't know, have you had any experiences with with the kind of the conservative end of this space, or are your circles mostly left?
On Twitter, definitely. I mean, I think I'd say a lot of my new mutuals are people in kind of like this, kind of conservative, naturalist space. Like you tend to have a lot of accounts now with like trees in their bios, right? And that's it's hard to know like where politically tradition according to traditional categories they're coming from, but many times they're like religious folks, right? Or people who recognize that, like you said, kind of the Koch brothers libertarian conservative neoconservative consensus is crumbling, and they're realizing that a lot of these principles in, say, permaculture really graft on well to kind of like traditional livelihoods.
Yeah.
It really grafts on well to the family farm, right? And foraging and hunting, like all of that stuff is part of kind of the permacultural matrix, so to speak. And so yeah, I mean, I think I interact more and more lately, actually, with more on the kind of traditional right side of the spectrum. But as you said, like I think me growing up, what I consider left and right, like I always considered a right wing to be like Bush, you know, Bush and Cheney kind of right wing. Like that was my interpretation of right wing, and I was like, oh, that stuff's bullshit, right? And now that we're seeing kind of this, I kind of see it as like an ideological wild west where all of these kind of political axes are being shaken up, right? And it's really exciting. I mean, there's also potential dangers in it, of course, but it's also really exciting to see that like a more for me a more useful axis is really kind of the localist versus globalist, right? And because that kind of transcends both left and right in a way. It's just a different political axis, I think, altogether. Um, Now, I guess this is kind of an aside, but that's not to say that I also see so one way I like to define localism is minimum viable scale, and sometimes I think that scale is still global, and so there will still be kind of like larger scales of governance. But I think that because we have this new technology, because we have kind of the crypto space and different kinds of protocols and smart contracts, like there's ways to govern at a higher scale when necessary, but in a more emergent fashion, right? In a more kind of consensus emergent fashion instead of kind of a top-down technocratic fashion.
Mhm.
And I can see this, going up all the way to a global scale. Like at a global scale, nuclear proliferation, that's a global scale problem. There's projected to be hundreds of millions of climate refugees in the next few decades. I would say that's a global scale problem. Tens of millions of people in Bangladesh are probably going to have to migrate due to climate change and rising sea levels. And by the way, they contributed some of the least to the actual emissions problems, and so that's why I also see that as a global problem. And so, I think that there's this kind of like new emergent realization that you know we can have kind of the benefits of globalization and of cosmopolitanism, but we can shed a lot of the cost that we've seen. And the distinction I make, kind of the conceptual distinction, is between kind of an extractive globalism, extractive both in terms of cultures, communities, and the environment, to a regenerative globalism, or actually I would say more of a planetary consciousness. So it's like a kind of localization in terms of our life, our life ways, but kind of a rising planetary consciousness in terms of like, we can collaborate when we need to, but we're not going to do it in the same way, that we've seen in the 20th century.
Yeah, that's kind of the argument I see a lot from people who say, okay, climate change is a global problem, therefore we need
Mm,
global government. And I always say,
yeah.
that's a leap. You need global
Right.
coordination. Global
Yeah.
government is very different. So
Exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, governance. I always make the distinction between government and governance, and governance does not imply necessarily a government, right? So I'm also wary of kind of a global government type solution. I think there's a high likelihood that would be horrible. But we can have collaboration, we can have governance, and again, we have the technology that's developing now that can help us collaborate much more effectively maybe than we did in the past. Of course, there's challenges to that. There's a lot of kind of dark stuff, dark potentials as well, in terms of like manipulation of narratives and memes, and kind of a hyper postmodern kind of everybody lives in their own reality. Like I think that's kind of a challenge, but the opportunity for sense making across localities and what I would call mimetic mediation is also much higher.
Yeah, and there is a bit of a clearing effect in these spaces. The intervals between the generation of bullshit and the uncovering of bullshit also get
But
tighter and tighter, because
yeah,
everything's so fast and iterative. Obviously,
yeah,
things can have runaway effects, but because information's so open, you do eventually find out. There is going to be someone on a forum somewhere who's going to be the whistleblower on something
right.
eventually. So I feel like that gives me hope. You mentioned permaculture. This is one thing that people push back on permaculture. It's just
Mhm,
this is kind of a basic criticism. It's like if everyone
mhm,
just grew stuff in their back doors, you would be missing out on the
uh-huh,
economies of scale, on
right.
the global logistics gains. You wouldn't be able to feed people without big plots of monoculture and
Mhm,
sending it around and I don't know.
yeah.
However, this stuff gets sent around in a very efficient way.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's a valid critique, and I think that's something that permaculturists need to contend with. A few things I would say. One, the industrial agriculture we see today, I would say, is not long for this world, just because it's incredibly energy intensive. It still mostly relies on fossil fuels for all the inputs. All of the pesticides, all of the fertilizers, are made through fossil fuels. The big machinery that is used for really large scale farming is still extremely fossil fuel dependent. We're losing topsoil at a rapid rate. A lot of large scale monoculture farmers they don't see soil, they see dirt as a medium for basically the chemicals that they put in to grow the crops. These chemicals wash off. They end up in the oceans. They're contributing to the die off of coral reefs and aquatic ecosystems. And so on one hand, I would say that the current mode is going to lead to along the current trajectory is not sustainable, and so it'll feed a lot less people in the long run. But two, I would also say that much of the world still feeds itself through kind of these kind of small scale, kind of informal kind of farmers and economies. I mean, much of kind of the sub-Saharan Africa still, many parts of Asia, and even Latin America are still feeding themselves this way. Um, I would also say that there's a distinction to be made between kind of economies of scale in terms of agricultural output and economies of scale in terms of logistics. So in terms of agricultural output, there's actually an inverse relationship between farm size and actual productivity. Smaller scale farms tend to grow more per acre than large scale farms. it is more labor intensive, right? But this to me ties into this other notion that we need to become more physical in general, right? And
Hmm.
so we need more people growing food and engaging in more manual labor to put in this labor input, and you can actually grow a lot of food. The second part, so the economies of scale and logistics, there is definitely that is definitely true, and just in terms of like distributing the goods, so the business end, there's certainly economies of scale, but again, I think, well, there's several opportunities. One, relocalizing economies. So if you think in terms of like a food shed, so say some what we would call a bioregion, not everyone's going to be growing food necessarily, right? I mean, that's why we have farmers markets and things like that. But the more people grow their own food, I mean, and right now it's more expensive to purchase food that way. But there's a lot of, I would say, low hanging fruit. I mean, just for example, having chickens in your yard, it's really easy to do that. That probably, eggs probably forms maybe like 30% of my calories, I would say. I eat eggs almost every day. Um, let's see what else. There's a great book that I would recommend to everybody called A Small Farm Future by Chris Smaje or Smahe. I'm not sure, but he basically makes the case that this kind of regenerative local agriculture can feed the world, but it would require that we de-urbanize. Um, if you think of New York City. Um, feeding itself in a future where perhaps there's not as much energy availability, right? So fossil fuels are going away one way or the other. They're running out, and they're bad for the climate. And renewables are definitely necessary, but there's a lot of arguments to say that they're not going to it's not going to power the economy at the same scale in the same way. And so, in order for agriculture to feed the world, or small scale regenerative agriculture to feed the world, there needs to be de-urbanization. So this still mean this doesn't mean that there's not going to be towns and kind of smaller cities, but there needs to just be a lot more people growing, and that requires more, kind of a redistribution of populations. Again, not top down or anything, but naturally kind of occurring. Um, and so, I guess that's a long way to say that we'll see, right? So, like, I think the people in the permaculture world still need to prove themselves, right? Like we need to prove that this mode can feed the world, so to speak. Um, and I think more and more every day we're seeing just how productive uh, you know these systems can be, just on a per acre basis. And so, but yeah, I guess that's my
Yeah.
answer. Yeah.
No, I think it's a
Mhm.
it's a good answer. I mean,
Mhm.
it's all a work in progress,
Yeah.
and there have been obviously in the past all sorts of experiments with this, kibbutz style
Yeah.
communes and things like that. But it does feel to me like it's gaining steam. Maybe it's just my echo chamber. I feel like a lot of people are engaged in this, and um, I think it's deurbanization as well. Like it might be anecdata, but man, do I know many, many people who have moved either to the countryside or to much smaller scale communities now. And my husband, he's from New Zealand, and in his family, there's a real estate agents, and they said every like the price of housing since coronavirus has been exploding in New Zealand just because everyone wants to buy their compound and move to
Right.
this pristine little place, which
Yeah.
which is kind of sad because we want to go there too eventually. So
Right.
that's
Right.
extending our timeline a little bit. But it does feel to me like you said, there's just this horizon of people being able to do urban stuff in non-urban
Mhm.
settings. So this is definitely a pressure to
Mhm.
to move people from there. Also, living in the city at the moment is a nightmarish. It's dystopian.
Right.
So
Right.
Yeah, I think that's I really have hope for this scenario, and also like you said, the decentralization and this the cosmopolitan localism does help with knowledge transfer. So I think it's going to be really cool. I mean, I'm currently in the situation where I'm pregnant. I'm going to have
Mhm.
a baby soon,
Congratulations.
and I'm looking at the world and I'm wondering, what shall I do with this child?
Uh-huh.
What opportunities could I offer him? And
Mm.
obviously thinking about homeschooling, my husband thinks I'm a little bit nuts because he said, oh, you need to socialize the child. You're just going to keep him
Uh-huh.
in the bunker and teach him about your right-wing conspiracy theories, and he's going to turn out the Unabomber or something.
Right.
But I'm curious what your position is on homeschooling or on the future of
Mm.
that. I'm sure you're kind of tangentially at least associated with movements like that, but I don't know.
Yeah.
What's your plan for your kids?
So I definitely think homeschooling is a good option for a lot of people. Like right now, we don't homeschool. We have a daycare. I think that we need to also though think about kind of the reformation of kind of public schooling. So and looking to the past and what they did. For example, the notion of kind of like the multi-age kind of schoolhouse where kids from all different ages interacted with each other. You had mentorship, kind of a mentorship model. And there was a lot more kind of physical activity, right? So this I think what the modern day kind of public education system is really a factory to spit out kind of conformist and highly disembodied people, right, in order to maximize their success in the labor market. But I think that that there are many models. So for example, I have a friend who lives in Uruguay, and she's from the states, and she has three kids, and the school that her kids go to is this kind of like one room schoolhouse thing where the parents are heavily involved. Like there's regular kind of social activities where the parents and the teachers engage with each other, and where the parents kind of help out with stuff, right? Like they might help mow the lawn, or so they take a very vested interest in kind of this community level schooling. And so I think that the future is definitely more localized. I don't know if it's always going to be localized to the household, but in terms of like the community, right? And this is where this notion of kind of like bringing back village economies, right? And bringing back like small towns, and one big perk of this is that you do know the other kids and their neighbors, and it's like the notion of it takes a village, right, to raise a child. And so it's kind of taking that very seriously. Um, and and so it's so I yeah, so I guess to put a bow on this, I definitely am in support of homeschoolers, and I think that's a great option for many in this current environment. But in the long term, as kind of a broad scale solution, I think we need to bring back kind of like local village schoolhouses, and heavy involvement with teachers and community in raising the children.
Yeah, yeah, for
Yeah,
sure. I mean, that would be my ideal case as well, to kind of maybe found some sort of homeschoolers association and just
yeah,
kind of get involved and just do it at a bit of a community level.
yeah,
And I definitely agree with you about the mixed environments. I really
mm,
do feel like a lot of the trauma and the bullying and everything that's going on is just this kind of this factory farm model of getting children of a lot of them of the same sex, they're all kind of
mm,
competing, they're jockeying for status and little rooms with minimal oversight. But
mm,
when if they were in a kind of a mixed environment, they would have kind of almost automatic status because they'd be ranked by age, and then they would have to kind of
right,
take care of the smaller kids and
yeah,
kind of defer to the bigger kids. So it teaches you a different type of socialization. It's not as
yeah.
Lord of the Flies as your usual school is.
Right. And I think this is also a big argument for, you know, um, you know, supporting multi-generational families as well, right? And I can't say that I've done that. Like my parents, my dad lives in Colombia, my mom lives in Oregon, my wife's family lives in Chile, and so we're, and we definitely feel kind of the lack from that, right? It's, it feels existentially painful to, not have your child being raised around their grandparents, right? And I think that, as we make this transition to a more, kind of localized way of living, just all of the kind of tacit knowledge that, grandparents teach children, right? And just as well as just kind of the support structure, right? Like the parents can go off and go on a date, right? Because the, grandma is watching them or something. I think that's something that we've just lost in society. It's one of the big downsides of, kind of what we've seen as modernization. And, again, it's leading to kind of like this, atomized model, which eventually becomes very centralized and statist, right? And the state is taking care of your children. And
Yeah.
yeah, I just think that trend is not long for this world because it's going to lead to, it's just going to lead to a lot of really depressed people. It already is. And
Yeah, and it really does put a lot of pressure on the act of having one child, and the act of, it's like this momentous thing that you're alone in, and maybe you and your husband can, I don't know, section off your time in a useful way, but you're probably going to have to go back to work. Like I was reading the
mm,
stat that, I don't know, 25% of US women go back to work like 2 weeks after they've given birth.
right. That's crazy. That's
No
nuts.
way. There's no
Right.
job in the
Right.
world that would
Yeah.
make you do that. But yeah, I mean, some people just
Yeah.
have no choice. There's no way
Mm,
to do it. And there's also a lot of kind of information about, if you putting infants, people who like children who are, nursing, putting them in
mm,
daycare. There's all sorts of, associations with that,
mm,
that might shock them in crazy ways, and, might lead to
mm,
trauma.
right.
Um, and that's kind of, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of room for improvement in these spaces, but until we, like you said, de-urbanize and in a way kind of get, it's weird to scale back. It's weird to
Mhm.
embrace the idea of, in a way, degrowth, and to
Yeah.
embrace the idea of adding friction to your life, which, like, living with your
Yeah.
family is added friction. It's
Absolutely. Absolutely.
it's gonna be hard to convince some people,
Yeah.
but I feel like that's going to be a necessary next step. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I don't see it so much, in one way it's scaling back, but I see it also as kind of an evolutionary transition where, we are bringing in, you know, new kinds of institutions, new technologies that we didn't have in the past, right? To aid this project. And so, part of it, as we talked about earlier, like bringing in the technology, the communications, many other parts of kind of decentralization. There's this movement called Cosmopolitanism, which is kind of having a global open source commons of like, you know, designs for machinery and things like that. But then the localization of production, like all of these things are technologies that provide us the opportunity to kind of go back to what was the best about kind of traditional living, and what was the best about life, but doing it in a way that's viable for the 21st century. And so, you know, I think that's an important distinction to make because, and just in terms of branding, because it is going back, but I see it as kind of a bringing forth of the best elements of, of our past, but doing it in a way that, we're still getting some of the benefits of modern technology, of communications and things like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard people refer to this as either archaeofuturism or
Mm.
trad humanism, and there's different
Nice.
streams. I think trad humanism comes from more the rationalist.
Uh-huh.
Archaeofuturism is kind of like, I think, a sociological term, and
Right.
actually this overlaps a little bit with something I've been reading recently from Alexander Dugin. This is a
Mm.
famed Russian
Yeah.
weirdo. Who,
Yeah, he's interesting.
yeah, he's quite
I
interesting.
haven't quite figured him out, but he's interesting.
I mean, if you just look at his web presence, you maybe
Mm.
recoil because it's quite strange, and he's kind of, he's in these kind of like magic with a K circles
Right.
and occult, and very
Right.
strange guy. But his books are quite interesting, and
Mm.
I was listening to Michael Millerman, who's kind of like the
Hmm.
premier scholar on Dugin,
Yeah.
and he was explaining that Dugin has he used to be a traditionalist, like old school kind of a Russian Orthodox traditionalist, and now his
Mhm.
perspective is more of kind of revivifying the past and finding the eternal, or kind of like ferreting out
Yeah.
what is what is the abolition of time or something like that, just
Mm.
extracting what is
Yeah.
eternal. And it's essentially the same idea, and it's again
Mm.
the confluence of streams of thought, also from the weirdo Russians coming to this
Right.
point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that also that it sounds familiar to me to John Gepser and his brand of what's called integralism, and he has kind of a similar idea. I mean, I'm going to totally butcher because it's very nuanced kind of picture, but he also sees kind of you know moving from kind of the pre he has like three phases, like pre-perspectival, perspectival, and a-perspectival, and right now we're in kind of this perspectival phase, but we're moving into an a-perspectival phase, which basically means that our notion of time you know just changes pretty radically, and so many elements of our past, from all the way from kind of like our kind of magical, mythic, archaic, all the way up through now, like they all kind of get integrated into the present, and they all kind of get brought forth into the present. And so it's interesting that I just mentioned that because it's interesting that this kind of notion is coming from many different angles, um, which I think is, I don't know,
Yeah.
encouraging.
Does
Yeah.
this overlap with like Ken Wilber's work, or Robert
Yeah. Yeah.
Keegan?
Yeah, it does. So Wilbur drew upon Gebser because Gebser was like early 20th century, and Wilbur, I would say, is a little bit more linear in his approach. Like he has like these stages of like
Yeah.
personal and cultural evolution, right? And I think Gebser would say, well, it's not so linear. It's much more nonlinear than that. But Wilbur definitely draws upon Gebser. And Kegan, yeah, I mean, Kegan has his own system, of kind of ego development, right? And how we think of ourselves in relationship to the world. And I'm not sure how strong a connection between Kegan itself and Gebser, but I know that Kegan and Wilbur are pals, and even though their systems are kind of different, but there's definitely some overlap.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's a really interesting field. I mean, I used to work for a company that was kind of had this kind of integralist approach baked in,
Mhm.
and we used to
Yeah.
have like subject object interviews as part of the
Right.
joining. So
Uh-huh.
it was quite a cool experience. So that's kind of the little I
Yeah.
know about the spaces from there. You
Right, and
you
there's also,
also.
you mentioned, just to, sorry to cut in, but so on in my bio I say metamodern localist, and so
Mhm.
metamodern metamodernism is kind of like, I would say, integral 2.0. That's just my point of view. I know a lot of integralists would would not like that. It's a little bit more. Whereas I think integral has more of kind of a boomer vibe, I would say metamodernism has a bit more of a millennial vibe to it, but it also brings in a lot of these kind of stage models and developmental models and things like that. Yeah. Anyway, just
Cool.
thought
Yeah,
that.
that was exactly my next question. Yeah, I mean, I'm curious because I've heard about metamodernism. I've heard like Alexander Bard talk about it. Don't
Mhm.
know much about it. Like, what's kind of the gist of metamodernism? What makes a
Yeah.
metamodernist?
Well, there's not one metamodernism. So like, and there's kind of evolved different strands, but I'd say, a core distinction. So there's kind of two main types of metamodernism, I would say. There's the descriptive type, where they're just seeing trends in culture and society of, well, we're moving beyond postmodernism. Where postmodernism, we you know is kind of a reaction to modernism, and it's kind of, it attempts to deconstruct. But what they're noticing is that there's kind of new movements in the art and culture that are kind of, are still bringing with them kind of the irony and kind of the kind of the critical view of postmodernism, but they're also kind of bringing in elements of modernism, like bringing back grand narratives, but in a more kind of self-aware sense. And the other, and then something else that's emerged is what I would call kind of prescriptive or political metamodernism, and a really kind of well-known author in the space goes by Hansi Freinacht, and he's written books called The Listening Society and Nordic Ideology. And he's really saying like this, this should be like a political project where we need to think about stages of development, working with people where they are, but also kind of infusing these ideas into our politics and our thinking. And so, what makes something metamodern? I would say one is kind of being, kind of influenced by postmodernism, but kind of being over it. Like, okay, like, we need to, like, sure, like, truth is nebulous and all of these things, but we can't build a society on that, right? Like it's just gonna, it's gonna eventually just decay and kind of eat itself alive, right? And so we need to actually propose new, kind of new ideas, new systems that, again, is kind of like critical of modernism, but also critical of postmodernism. And so I think that's one of the cores. I mean, another like I think the main developmental stage model that Hansi Freinacht likes is the model of hierarchical complexity, like by Commons. I forget his first name. He's not as big on like Robert Kagan or spiral dynamics, so kind of the Wilberian model. But there's actually a great article that maybe we can link to called "5 Ways That You Know That You're Meta Modern," and some of the ways include like awareness of allergies. So, like for example, if you go through a list of just terms like communism, capitalism, socialism, like feminism, and if you instinctively have kind of a negative reaction to it, that means you have an allergy. And so, being meta modern means that you're kind of stoic in the sense with terminology, and you're really interested in like kind of digging into the details and not fighting over, as we talked about earlier, like all of these terms floating around, and it's like, oh, you call yourself that, so I don't like you, right? But like, what does that actually mean in practice? And another one is awareness of hierarchies, and so he distinguishes between game acceptance and game denial. So game acceptance is like, okay, I just accept kind of the traditional hierarchies as they are, and game denial is, I kind of, um, I pretend that hierarchies don't exist, and so it's about kind of creating a new set of hierarchies that make sense, right? That are somewhat natural in a sense, are not based on your on your background or your race or your creed, but are based on a better criteria. Like just for example, I could be very good at building. I'm a builder. People are going to defer to me. That's a hierarchy, right? That's a hierarchy that makes sense. And so, not being afraid of hierarchies, but also not accepting kind of the packaged hierarchies of the past as well. And there's a few others that I could list on, but there's a lot of I guess a lot of things that make you meta modern.
Yeah, I mean that's super fascinating. I mean, it's there's always kind of the challenge to know how much can you calibrate this stuff, because a lot of it, is kind of emergent. We're great apes. We're quite advanced great apes, but we are, we
Mm.
kind of have a certain instinct for hierarchy. And to
Mm.
me, that because I've been kind of in the effective altruist scene, and in game B and things like that,
Right.
and a lot of times it seemed to me that things, because people weren't necessarily aware of kind of the the biological substructure, that a lot of stuff
Mhm.
is emergent. These spaces would collapse in just trying to coordinate in coordination
Right.
efforts, or someone coming in with kind of like an extreme version of an ideology and trying to take over the whole space. And because everyone was so
Right.
conciliatory and so consensus driven, they
Right.
would allow that. And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
it was just eternal conflicts about wokeness and not wokeness, and
Right. Right.
yeah. and then I
Mhm.
would just leave at one point because it got really scary. So I
Right,
think
right.
that setting a limit, because it's like, it's in a
Hmm.
way, to me it feels like it's easy to say, okay, we're open to flexible hierarchies, but
Hmm.
in a way, maybe that's why I'm maybe instinctively more drawn to the right side of the spectrum, because I feel like, okay,
Yeah,
just for things to function, you need a little bit of a structure. The structure is precious. It's important.
right.
Obviously, if it's too rigid, it turns into hell on earth. But I tend to defer to the structure a little bit more than most people.
Right. Yeah. I mean, somebody who says that we should get rid of all hierarchies, I would just say, "Oh, have you ever had kids?" Right? Like, are you really gonna, treat your 2-year-old as an absolute equal? Right? Like, if your kid 2-year-old doesn't want to go to bed, are you just gonna say, "Okay"? If they just want to eat sugar all and candy all day, you're just gonna say, "Okay." Like, your perspective is as valid as mine, right? And so, extend that to society, and you're right. You use the word fluid hierarchies, but like, we don't want rigid hierarchies that don't have validity, right? We don't want invalid hierarchies, but we do want, we do want a culture where we can recognize that somebody has skills or perspectives or insight that you should defer to, right? For a given set, in a given circumstance. Not doesn't mean that I'm going to defer to you in every part of my life, but and that's where the fluidity comes in, where it's like, there might be a higher, me and my friend, there might be a hierarchy in one set of circumstances, but then it'll be reversed in another set of circumstances. And so that's, I think, where the fluidity comes in. And so navigating kind of the fluidity, but not having it so fluid that it just kind of spills out,
Yeah,
spills
it
out everywhere.
becomes
Yeah,
dysfunctional.
and
Yeah.
that kind of oscillation, I think, is a very meta-modern kind of sensibility, where you're consistently oscillating from these different perspectives, in a way that, not in a way to kind of have like the kind of perspectival madness, or multi-perspectival madness, but in a way where you're actually like, you're able to move forward, you're able to kind of construct, whatever you're trying to construct.
Yeah, and it feels to me like this is something that the West has historically done better than maybe the East or more Eastern regions, just because the hierarchies of competence have mattered more in the West, just because there was more to do, especially after the Industrial Revolution. There's the
Hmm.
competency had a high market value, which was
Right.
not necessarily that important in more stagnant cultures, like where you had subsistence agriculture, then you had three stratums of feudal lords, and then there was the Sultan in Istanbul, and that
Right.
was it. So it is interesting to, yeah, sorry.
So no, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I mean, a lot of the stuff that I notice, my main noticing is kind of between these two cultures, because I grew up in
Hmm.
Romania. I spent most of my life there, and then I moved to the West and worked
Hmm.
there for about 10 years, and kind of just seeing the differences and seeing kind of
Yeah.
like the coordination that happens in the West, and kind of how
Hmm.
that functions, and how that's now eroding in some circles,
Right.
and then contrasting that with kind of just a different game theoretic equilibrium that we had here, which is much more
Hmm.
inclined towards the defect option,
Yeah.
and contrasting those two, it did seem to me like always like a big difference, and I'm curious what your feeling is about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not as familiar with the East, right? Like, I've been in the West all my life. But what you're describing, it seems like, it's almost what you're describing is kind of the baby in the bathwater of modernity, right? Of kind of this notion of progress, this notion of competency hierarchies or meritocracies or something. But what we've been talking about throughout a lot of this conversation is relocalizing. A lot of what we would call subsistence agriculture, and so we're saying, hey, we need to get back to this stuff, because that's, we've also thrown out the baby of the bathwater of what you're describing in your experience of the East, right? And so I would say that's also a very meta modern move, is to say, like, how can we kind of creatively, reconstruct a new system, bringing forth all of the best aspects of the old system, right? So we still want like the coordination mechanisms that we get through modernity, right? And we get through, digital technology and things like that. But we don't want to live there. Like we actually want to live in a place, in a home. We want to, be in touch with much more with, where does our food come from? Where do the sources of our sustenance come from? And that's from a modernist perspective, that's kind of like stagnation. But from kind of this metamodern perspective, like, or at least my metamodern perspective, I'm not going to speak for the whole scene. That's like, like there's many aspects of that we want to get back to. I mean, I think cottagecore is all about trying to get back to kind of like, you know, a quasi subsistence or self sufficient life, right?
Yeah, I'm like speaking about cottagecore. One of the major accusations that's been thrown at kind of our semi mutual circle
Mm-hmm.
of scene is the accusation of LARPing. You know,
Mm-hmm.
what's your what's your vibe on LARPing? I'm actually pro LARPing, but
Yeah.
I'm curious what do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, we're all LARPing right now. I mean, we're all kind of, these kinds of alien, we're these alienated subjects in this modern, postmodern world, and we're trying to recover something that we've lost, right? And so, I'm LARPing. I'm a baby homesteader. Like, we're all LARPing, but it's like you LARP until you make it, right? Like, you keep LARPing, and that's how you learn. And eventually, your LARP index will decrease if you take it seriously.
Yeah,
So yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is like the amount of kind of embedded, embodied, tacit wisdom that, say, our great 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 grandparents had, with regards to kind of self sufficiency, on land, and being able, is just orders of magnitude greater than what we have at the moment, right? What we know. But and so we need to recover that, and so yeah, I mean, part of recovering that is LARPing until you get there.
yeah, it is interesting because my grandfather, he on my mother's side and on my dad's side, he was a kind of subsistence peasant that only got shoes, I think, for his seventh birthday or something. Like, he
Right.
was hardcore, tied to the ground,
Yeah.
one generation removed from literal serfs. So
Right. Right.
yeah, and he had all this knowledge. But it's interesting because even during communism, the glory days of giving something to your children was to get them as far as possible from that knowledge from the land,
Right.
because
Yeah.
if you're a subsistence farmer, you kind of, you want to escape that condition because you want to get to a more
Right.
comfortable existence. But
Yeah.
it's, like in the span of 50 years, we've moved from that to someone leaving food at my door and I don't even have to see his face. Like,
Right.
it's
Right.
really accelerated up to a crazy degree. And
Right. Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, I think what I would call new localism is we're trying to recover a lot of that lifestyle, but we want to utilize kind of these modern technologies to decrease the downside risk of that, right? So, for example, modern medicine, I think still should have a place, right? Like, the infant mortality rate of the past, we don't necessarily want to replicate that, right? Um, the ability to have this cosmopolitan element where if there's kind of like a natural disaster in your village, you are tapped in still to this global network, that of mutual aid, perhaps, right, where you're not as isolated as before, and because you're not as isolated, you are taking out some of that downside risk of kind of the hyper localization, right? As well as just kind of, you know, depending on the circumstance, just the malnutrition, et cetera, et cetera. Like, if there was like a plague, or a plague, or whatever it is, like a lot of those, dark downside elements, ideally in the new localism, would be much less.
Yeah. And I feel like, in a way, there's an escapability to LARPing at the moment, because
Mm.
I was just thinking, what would absolve you of the accusation of LARPing if you're like, if you're someone who's engaged in permaculture or things like that.
Yeah.
It would be if a relative would hand down this information to you. I mean, you would have to be Amish, essentially.
Yeah.
That's about it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you would have to grow up, where, in a society where by the age of 11, you're able to kind of like do most of the activities on the farm, right? Whereas me, I started homesteading at the age of 36, right? And so I have no kind of embodied cognition around it. I have to learn everything from scratch, like I'm a 2-year-old, right? And so, but I think a metric for me of like when aren't we LARPing anymore is just, for example, what percentage of my food do I grow or get locally, right? So it's both LARPing an individual homesteader, but also kind of like at a localized economy, right? And so I see it. My project is kind of dual of like, promoting kind of local food systems in general, and that's part of what I study and do at the university, um, as well as kind of at a bioregional level. But the proof is definitely in the pudding there, right? Right now most of our calories still come from the supermarket, and I'm ashamed to say it, but there's just no, there's just not other good options at the moment. And so in 10 years, say now if 10% of our food is grown or bought locally, if that's not like up to 50% or higher, I'll be disappointed, right? And so there's for me there's some clear metrics of like, okay, like when am I not a LARPer anymore?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you have to negotiate that with yourself and with
Yeah.
the Twitter trolls.
Exactly.
No, because this is essentially kind of the discussion I have, less
Mhm.
about permaculture and localism, but about trad. About it being trad. Somehow
Yeah.
I've been co-opted into this meme because I believe in differences between the sexes and other crazy things, and um,
Um,
it's this whole thing about trad larpers, people who
mhm.
aren't trad. But I mean, I've seen a lot of people, moving to the countryside and having children, and if this is the result of a LARP, I'm like, more power to you.
Yeah.
It's more than
Yeah.
most people are doing. So
Right,
yeah.
exactly. I mean, I was kind of like trolling trads yesterday on Twitter where I was saying like, because there's a Teddy K line like the Industrial Revolution and its consequences of the word disaster for the human race, and I wrote pre-digestion and its consequences of the word disaster for the human race. Pre-digestion means the invention of fire, right? Because before we had fire, we had much bigger, we had much bigger guts, and much smaller brains, and because we were able to cook our food and pre-digest it, a lot of the energy was able to go into the creation of our brains, into the complexity of our cultures, et cetera. And so it's like, there is kind of this, kind of, trad in one way is a little bit absurd, just because where is the period in history that you're gonna trad to? Like a small scale
Yeah.
farm. Well, most of human history was hunter gatherers, right? Like why not? And so, but I think the way to get around this, this kind of trolling is again to say that we're not trying to go back to the past. We're trying to bring the best parts of the past into the future, like of all the ages of indigenous consciousness, hunter gathering, traditional kind of small farming, all of these things we're trying to bring back into the present, bring up into the present, and really try and recover the really good things that we've
Yeah,
lost
through the sacred act of LARPing.
through the
So
sacred act of LARPing. In fact, if you're not LARPing, that means I think that means you're stagnant, right? Like that means that you're comfortable with the status quo. You're a perfect frictionless libertarian subject, and you know, God bless you. If you're not LARPing, you're not pushing the boundaries.
exactly. I like
Yeah,
this. LARPers of the world unite.
that's right. Amen.
Oh, perfect. So there was a question of the show that I want to ask
Mhm.
you, and
Yeah.
it refers to a subversive thinker. Is there
Mhm.
someone that you'd like to recommend to people that you think is not getting enough airtime that people would benefit from knowing, either tied
Mhm.
to permaculture or whatever you're interested in? We've got all sorts of candidates for this one.
Yeah, yeah. So I was thinking about this question, and I'm thinking that this thinker might be subversive for your audience, not necessarily for my audience. And this person is Joe Brewer. He recently wrote a book. It's free online called "The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth," and he's very uncompromising in terms of like, he's basically saying like, ecological collapse is happening. Um, he's more of a doomer than I am. Like he sees that there's just going to be a lot of population die off through this. But he's also very constructive in the sense that he's what you would call a bioregionalist. Or he talks about bioregional regeneration, where he talks about like we need to recover kind of indigenous consciousness, and this and also he uses terms like decolonization, which might be an allergy to some on the right. But his thing is all about, we need to start organizing at a bioregional scale to design our lifestyles around landscapes and around the regeneration of landscapes. And we need to create kind of global networks across bioregions. So it's basically what we've talked about with cosmological localism, but thinking at the bioregional scale. And I would say that he's definitely, he's kind of a brilliant polymath. So that's why I say he's very underrated. He's well versed in like complexity science and cognitive science and evolutionary theory. I mean, he's probably one of the most well-read people I've ever met. And he's currently in Barichara, Colombia, basically trying to bootstrap, his vision there. And so, I'd say he's subversive because he's uncompromising. He doesn't sugarcoat the how stark our predicament is. But he's also brilliant, and he titled his book "The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth." So he's also very uncompromising. It's like, all of you other people are full of shit, like like you're just deluding yourselves. But here's a path forward, for preserving life, including human life on Earth. And so that's my candidate.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard of him, so definitely a good recommendation. It's I feel like complexity science is is really a lens that is coming in fast here
Right.
because
Yeah.
what we're dealing with is scale, like you said. The big
Hmm.
differences between localism and globalism, and I was tweeting with Joe Norman before a podcast, and he said that you
Wow.
have you guys are writing a paper together. Yeah,
Yeah.
tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, it's just starting, so we'll see what develops out of it. But the tentative title is Cosmopolitan Localism and Anti-Fragility, and I think the main outlines of the article are that we need localism to kind of prevent downside risk in terms of like the fragility of large scale systems. And so we need to decentralize, we need to relocalize, but we need the cosmopolitan part, kind of the information flow, one to kind of speed up innovation across these spaces. So like kind of what I was talking about with the permaculture space. But it also kind of decreases another kind of risk, another kind of downside risk, which I think we've also kind of talked about, where if everyone's completely isolated in their hyper localized communities, if a disaster hits one place, sure, it won't spread, so nearly as much as in a globalized economy, so you're decreasing that risk, but you're also, there's no safety net, right? At least that's my interpretation of kind of where we're going. He might disagree. And so when we're thinking about anti-fragility, we need to kind of, again, combine the best of both worlds of localism, but also kind of connectivity, but a kind of connectivity that that we can strategically disconnect when necessary. So I think that's definitely what he's emphasizing. Of like, for example, with the pandemic, we need the ability to, for example, prevent interstate travel or something, right? Which decreases the downside risk of connectivity. And so, so it's really going to be about kind of combining the best of these. Basically, I think this whole conversation, but probably in more language aligned with like Taleb, complexity, Norman complexity, which he is really bringing in, because I'm fascinated by complexity thinking and complexity science, but I'm a neophyte and he's the expert. So,
Yeah, for sure.
a lot of the really kind of like technical language and stuff is going to come from him.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big Joe Norman fan. I've
Yeah.
learned a lot from just reading his tweets. To be honest, I haven't
Right.
really read much
Yeah.
more, but
Yeah. Same here. He was
yeah,
one of my big influences, both for localism, because before I was a localist, I was like I considered myself a metamodernist, and then kind of a bioregionalist. And he's really he's really the one who, like, you know made me realize how much insight and wisdom is in kind of localism. This idea of homesteading. Like, I don't think I'd be a homesteader right now if it wasn't for Joe Norman. So props to him. I owe him a lot in terms of my intellectual evolution.
yeah, I'm definitely a big Joe Norman stan, and Chelsea Norman as well. Shout out to
Yeah, yeah, she's
Chelsea.
great.
Yeah,
She's great. Yeah,
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 she's got good. She's given me
mhm,
lots of super useful info for this
yeah.
whole biological journey that I'm on for the
Right,
first
right.
time. So
Yeah,
it's super important.
mhm,
And what I love about their presence is like they're in a way they're one of us. It's not just like
Mm-hmm.
cottagecore LARPing and stuff like that. It's not just like an aesthetics account, because
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the stuff, and that's kind of also why I understand why people kind of make fun of the trad meme and stuff,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of people just posing in plaid shirts and stuff, and sort of cutting
Right.
down
Right.
trees for no reason.
Uh-huh.
But there's, I mean, what they show, even in terms of lifestyle and stuff,
Mhm.
is very I don't know, fact based. I hate this concept, but it's like they've
Yeah.
lived it. They know what they're talking about, and they're doing it
Mhm.
for essentially the same reasons that I would do it. Because I've kind of
Right.
been like, in a way, like a technocrat, and then I've kind of
Mhm.
seen the error of my ways and did a
Yeah.
180. So yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, Jason, I'm super happy you came on. I love this conversation. Is there anything else you're working on? Anything else that you want people to know about, or where people can find you?
Um, not at the moment that I can think of. You can find me on Twitter at Cognizor. For being a self-described localist, I'm pretty social, and so if you DM me, I'll probably respond. And if you're interested in these ideas, and you want to talk about it more, let me know. I'm happy to share insight and information. And I also want to thank you very much, Alex. This has been a really delightful conversation, and it's nice to get to know you a little bit.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm super